Hi, everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined by WPR managing editor Freddy Deknatel. Hi, Freddy.
Hey, Judah.
And WPR associate editor Prachi Vidwans. Hi, Prachi.
Hi, Judah.
We'll be talking about the demonstrations in cities across the United States to protest police brutality against and killings of Black Americans, and the international dimensions of both racial injustice in America and the popular movements to end it. Before we get started, just a quick mention that unfortunately we had some technical difficulties with this week's interview episode of the podcast, but we'll be back with a new one next week. Prachi, Freddy, turning to the topic, it's obviously a very upsetting one, a very somber one, one that I think hits very close to home for everyone, American and increasingly what we've seen around the world, for people who have looked to America over the years for inspiration, but also who have seen America for what it is over the years as well. And we've seen protests around the world sympathetic to the ones going on in the U.S. So Prachi, let me turn it over to you. When you look at the events of the last week, the last 10 days, what's made the biggest impact on you?
Well, it's really hard to pinpoint just one thing that has had a big impact. I think the last week has been kind of an emotional roller coaster for everyone, but especially for people who are invested in racial justice, and particularly for Black Americans. To some extent, this issue hits home because I am a person of color. In another real way, it just highlights for me how privileged I am and how Asian Americans and Indian Americans have benefited from the work of activists, including the ones who are organizing the peaceful protests and, you know, whose years and decades of work have led to this moment. It's hard to know whether to be hopeful about the great upswelling of support that has been seen on social media, especially, but also in these waves of protests of many people turning out to the streets despite risks of contracting coronavirus, or whether to give into fear because of the conflict that's come about between, you know, police escalating violence at the protests and Trump threatening to send in the military, and just all of this is kind of taking place against the context weakening institutions in American democracy. It's just such a huge issue. And I guess ultimately I don't see this as an isolated incident. You know, these social movements, the civil society that's supporting it have been growing and building for a long time. And I hope that this moment will bring about some real change and at minimum a heightened awareness of how interconnected it is with American history. But yeah, I feel like there's just so much to unpack here. It's hard to pick out one thing. I think the threat to American democracy has been definitely scaring me, though, like the long-term implications of these protests.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to everything Prachi said, and not to bring it back to Donald Trump, like so many things that have been happening for the last few years, but, you know, the protests and the police brutality and, you know, the claims that the police should essentially be unaccountable for killing Black men. That's not, unfortunately, obviously nothing new. And so the protests and the scale of them was new. But in terms of, you know, the incidents itself, it's obviously become all too familiar. So I think what struck me the most in particular this week was what happened on Monday, where Trump, you know, ordered National Guard, military police, whatever designation they were, to tear gas peaceful protesters so that he could have a photo op in front of the White House. And we have seen, I think, since then that's led to bigger protests, and it's had, you know, the opposite effect of probably what Trump had in mind in terms of cowing people and trying to end the protests. But it's also chilling, and I think it was, you know, the clearest indication yet that the fears we've had about Trump in office since he came in have not been overblown or overstated. I cannot remember any time in recent American history, even maybe I'm wrong, in reading about the civil rights era, but having the president of the United States deliberately tear gas and beat peaceful protesters who were exercising their constitutional rights. That to me, I think, is the most shocking.
I think for me, it's sort of a combination of what you both said. There's a specificity of racism against Black people in the United States and the racial injustice in the United States that's so particular to the United States. There's racism obviously all over the world. I lived in France for almost 20 years and saw a huge amount of racism against African immigrants and French children of African immigrants. And so there is racism in other parts of the world, but it never expresses itself in the same way. And there's something very particular and something very central about racial injustice in the United States and the way it's so ingrained and endemic. And that it always comes up anytime I'm talking about the United States to someone who's not American. And I feel like it's always present in any conversation that one has with a fellow American as well. It's always there, whether in the background or the foreground, whether because someone has been the target of it or because someone is trying to be conscious and aware and to be an ally. But it's always either in the background or in the foreground. And then at the same time, over the course of the last week, 10 days, we've seen the way in which this very specific issue, and I think it's important not to lose sight of the very specific issue that has provoked these protests, but the way in which it has then been woven into all of these other corrosions and deteriorations in the United States in terms of institutions, in terms of democracy, in terms of the way in which Trump has had a very corrosive effect on Washington, as well as on the country in terms of the response by certain governors, for instance. And so the way in which it has amplified and been amplified by all this surrounding fabric that's been woven over the past 3 years by Donald Trump. So I think that interaction between those two things for me, and I'll add that the videos that I've seen of police brutality against Black people, but also against the protesters protesting the violence against Black people, have been just shocking. And even for someone who, growing up in New York, I saw my share of protests that were handled in a very rough manner. I didn't witness, but I lived through the police riot in Tompkins Square Park. So I don't have a naive view of the New York police or police forces in general. But I have to admit that those videos really did shock me and have a huge impact on me in terms of just my emotional state over the last 3-4 days.
Yeah, I think that police brutality, police riots, protesters getting manhandled by the police is nothing new in American history. Obviously, we all know the images of the civil rights era of freedom riders and other protesters, getting blasted with fire hoses or, just beaten by police. But I think that, social media on the one hand now makes so much more of that visible immediately. We see within an hour or two instances of police brutality in New York or Philadelphia or Los Angeles. I mean, and not just police, but militarized police. There's been footage in LA of police in what are, basically retired military vehicles. And that's a legacy of, the post 9/11 era where all this excess military equipment, for whatever reason, was handed down to police across America. And they don't obviously have the training, it seems, to handle it, because one thing I always read about is veterans or people in the armed services saying that the way that police handle themselves with this kind of equipment is exactly not how it's supposed to be handled when the military is patrolling the streets of a foreign city or something like that. But I think also what is new about this is that immediacy. And I think that, and also just how targeted it is. I mean, I don't want to be too naive about, the abuses and brutality that happened in the past in America, but the idea that this is all coming, with the express, approval of the White House is what's shocking. I mean, there were obviously governors and other leaders in American history who have condoned and even sort of championed racism and also repression against people fighting racism, but we've never seen it so directly from the president.
Prachi, you mentioned the fear factor in terms of people going out onto the streets knowing that there's a very high possibility of police repression or repression by the National Guard or what we're seeing in Washington. I know for me, I've watched protests over the past year and over time in countries like Algeria, in countries like Sudan during the Arab Spring, in countries like Egypt, and I often felt this sense of admiration for people who went out on the street to protest like that, knowing the consequences that were very likely and almost inevitable. And in the U.S., there's always been a legacy of heavy-handed policing for sure, but I don't think I've ever assumed that people who go out for a peaceful protest in the United States should expect to be the target of police violence, and that's actually what's happening right now.
Yeah, I do think it is. I mean, the role of police violence in protest is interesting and complicated, I guess. Like, to some extent, some protest movements do gain traction, I guess, when there is police brutality against protesters. I mean, it's not something that you want to happen. It's not something that you count on. You can see that kind of mechanism working even in like the Hong Kong protests, where after incidents of really shocking police brutality happened there, the movement got a new surge of support. I mean, in social movement scholarship, I've seen that described as basically an inflection point where neutral observers from the outside can't be neutral anymore, because you're seeing the real expression of what are more institutional biases. You're seeing them play out on bodies, on the protesters' bodies. I think in terms of the fear factor, that's an element also where I see privilege playing out, in that I think it seems from what I've read that a lot of Black Americans don't feel like they can be quiet anymore, because even if they're not going out to protest, members of this group are still dying. So I think the view of seeing it as something optional it's a privileged view about going to protest or not. But yeah, I think to Freddy's point also about social media, it's interesting to see, because I do think that social media has globalized this issue in a new way. However, I wonder if it has led to more accountability. I mean, I haven't looked at the numbers on this or anything, but we're seeing more and more phone videos of harassment go viral pretty often, not just during protests. And sometimes it does lead to accountability, and that's great. But I wonder if you scale that up, how much it's actually been able to change practices. Or I get the sense that most of the consequences for people who are caught harassing, whether it's, the woman who threatened to call the police on the man who's bird watching in Central Park. For her, I mean, I think it had consequences for her career, but I don't know if incidents like that in the past few years have led to any kind of legislative change or greater protections for Black people against harassment. And as well, I know that instituting body cams have not really led to any increased accountability from what I've seen. So it's interesting that we are more interconnected. We do have more of these tools now. Social media has led to greater connectedness between activists and helped them organize movements. But in some ways, it's like that Mark Twain quote, history doesn't often repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
Right. And just with regard to the 2 points you made, the Central Park incident, if I'm understanding you correctly as well, there were obviously severe consequences for that woman. Had she been a police officer in uniform, the fact that there was a video that went viral might not have actually changed anything in terms of any consequences for them. In this case, there was this absolutely brutal video of the killing that actually resulted in, after a delay, murder charges being brought against the police officers. But oftentimes, the videos that we've seen from of police brutality at protests, it wouldn't be surprising to me, for instance, if there were no consequences for the police. There have been a couple cases, actually, an incident in Atlanta, for instance, that led to police officers being firing. But oftentimes, there aren't consequences for these videos. Something else you said, and I wanted to just acknowledge it, that the point of view that I expressed about feeling like this is a first time that protesters will go out and actually know they'll face police violence and brutality ignores the ways in which Black Americans and other targeted Americans or marginalized, societally marginalized or oppressed communities do face police violence on a daily basis and don't have the luxury of that assumption. The part about violence also, I think, cuts both ways in the sense that, and I think that there was a possible tipping point that Trump was trying to exploit 3-4 days ago with regard to the looting that was going on. And I saw that take place in France over the course of the Yellow Vest movement, where there was an initial period of peaceful protest, but very quickly there were people who took advantage of the protests to tag along and cause violence at the end, and to there wasn't as much looting, but there was a lot of damage to businesses and banks in particular, and that really turned public opinion against the protest movement. And so I was very reassured to see that in the past couple days, the looting has actually decreased, which creates less of an opening for people like Trump and people who are sympathetic to that law and order and heavy-handed response to ignore the actual root cause of the protests. But I think also that kind of brings up the international aspects and prism of the protests, in the sense that when you see Trump calling for those kinds of responses, with the bitter irony of it coinciding this year with the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre on Thursday, it very clearly has an undermining effect on these U.S. Objectives of accusing China of abuses, rightfully accusing China of abuses of human rights, whether from 31 years ago or in Xinjiang and Hong Kong today. But it's very hard to condemn the use of force on peaceful protesters 31 years ago while advocating for it today in the U.S.
Yeah, there was a meeting earlier this week, I think, that Mike Pompeo had to effectively mark the anniversary of Tiananmen Square and criticize China again over its actions in Hong Kong, which, is just another sign of that sort of absurd reality right now. And I think you also have seen it. I mean, it's not just opportunistic criticism from countries that are looking to distract from their own human rights records, whether that's China or Russia or Iran, or places that usually, when there are instances of police brutality in the U.S. or instances in the Trump era where there's been this sort of gross violation of democratic norms, or however you want to put it, they selectively try to criticize the U.S. But I think it's been more telling to see from U.S. allies, whether Canada or comments from the EU's foreign policy chief, or the kinds of leaders of America's closest allies, that are criticizing Trump in a way that, American presidents don't get criticized by their allies that way. At least they hadn't before this. And I think that that international dimension is also, on the one hand, there's the hypocrisy side of it and it goes both ways in terms of the Trump administration's hypocrisy in criticizing Hong Kong or other human rights violations in other countries. And then, that opportunism from the Chinese Communist Party, for example, to try to shine a light on the protests here, to distract from their own abuses. But I also think that it just sort of crystallizes for the rest of the world these longstanding problems that the U.S. has never dealt with fully. This was a point that Howard French got at in his column this week about, this inability of the U.S. over decades to deal with its grave racial divide, even after the civil rights movement and the progress that was made. The U.S. during the Cold War looked at the Soviet Union, as Howard describes, and sort of projected this idea that the Soviet Union's ethnic diversity was going to lead to its disintegration or downfall. That ended up not being the case. The Soviet Union collapsed for other reasons, obviously, but all of that was sort of a projection by U.S. observers and even journalists at the time to sort of ignore the problems at home. And I think that that's just clear more than ever today, how many problems are being ignored.
Yeah, I think that some of this hypocrisy in a healthier democracy, the criticism from other countries saying, how can you criticize our human rights record when you have this at home, could theoretically lead American leadership to take challenges more seriously at home and really address some of these abuses. Because, there shouldn't be a contradiction in the U.S. supporting Hong Kong protest. I mean, the rights that protesters in Hong Kong are fighting for are the ones that protesters in the U.S. are exercising right now. The right to protest, the right to free speech. So there shouldn't be this contrast. I think that unfortunately these criticisms of hypocrisy are probably not going to work on the Trump administration. He contradicts himself all the time, and it doesn't really seem to affect his support among his base or to really affect him to be called out on moments like that.
I think it's important to add as well, though, that to defend against or to be cautious about falling into the trap of false equivalencies. The U.S. clearly, and in this week and the past 10 days or so, it's been on clear display the vast gaps between what America professes in terms of its ideals and values and what it actually practices at home, but also abroad, obviously. There are plenty of populations around the world who would dispute very forcefully the idea that America is always a force for democracy and human rights, and at home as well. At the same time, the U.S. is the idea of American values is not that they're ever perfectly practiced, but that there's an honest conversation about them and an effort to move closer and closer, or to address more and more the ways in which they are imperfectly practiced. And I think also the question of the press and the right to protest and the right for the press to cover it. And I think that the reaction to the Trump administration's response this past week shows that I don't think anyone in America is prepared to just let those be buried without a fight. There were instances of police violence against the press as well, and they were very loudly criticized and very widely publicized as well. And so I think that it is important to recognize that as imperfect as the U.S. is, there is that effort to address it and certain protections for addressing it. And I guess I'd just add that as well, the movements in the U.S. to address its imperfections, and in particular racial injustice, have often created connections and dialogues with other parts of the world throughout history and even recently. So the kind of dialogue and interactions and sort of mutual influences between the U.S. civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s and the anti-colonial and post-colonial liberation movements in Africa and Asia at the time are well known and well documented. There's also the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement has also served as a new inspiration around the world. I know in France there's actually a French version of that's coalesced. And I think that some of the sympathy protests that we've seen in France and in the UK and around Europe are as much awakenings or expressions of a domestic protest movement as sympathy. And in that way, there's been this cross-fertilization of inspiration between the movements in the U.S. to address these imperfections and movements elsewhere. And Prachi as well, there's been cross-fertilization in terms of more generally protest movements for pro-democracy, whether between Hong Kong and the U.S. I saw a Lebanese protest organizer sharing tips and tactics on Twitter for the use of American protesters this past week. So there too, there's a dialogue among movements, even that aren't necessarily specific to the issue of racial justice.
Yeah, definitely. I think, at least from what I've seen, I've perceived that there are always going to be resonances when you talk about human rights in every context. Although, of course, some contexts are going to be worse than others, as you mentioned. I have seen, over the last decade, protesters actively learning from the experiences of other movements. Just last week, a Bolivian activist was telling me, I really get what Egypt was going through during the Arab Spring now that Bolivia is itself trying to go through a democratic transition. I think more and more activists look to examples of what they're going through from the past, not only in their own countries, but also in other countries that are, as we're experiencing this global democratic decline. So in the current protests, you see things like activists learning from other movements how to deal with tear gas, how to de-escalate a protest. If there's someone next to you who's yelling, how to get them to calm down to maintain the nonviolence of that protest, how to deal with police, how to keep your phone secure when you go to protest. These are all tactics that haven't developed in one context. They're borrowed over time. I think, again, social media and the internet has been a huge help in that. But there's also just this increasing solidarity between movements that comes with greater interconnections and activists having more and more chances to meet each other and share their knowledge.
Yeah, I'm reminded also of I was in Egypt at various points in 2011 and after, during the protests there, and have a lot of close friends who were reporters who covered the initial uprising every day and were out in the streets and afterwards. And it's been, I guess, interesting to say the least to compare at least the images and the tactics taken by police here in the U.S. now to what happened in Egypt. Now, obviously they're not equivalent situations. In Egypt, hundreds of people were shot by the security forces and there was far more serious, brutality in an authoritarian context, but also there's other things that are eerily similar in terms of the approaches of police, but also the commitment and organization of activists. In Egypt, it was a fight against an entrenched autocrat. In the U.S., obviously, this fight against racism and institutionalized racism. But, those common connections and also, eerie echoes, I think, can't really be ignored.
Prachi, any final thoughts before we move on to the WPR articles we're going to flag this week?
I guess just to say that the awareness of how interconnected movements are around the world and how each protest kind of builds on another, for me, that has been a source of hope, even as the country is going through such a difficult time right now. We wouldn't be at this point having these discussions if it weren't for protesters that have led movements in the last decade, in the last, century of activism. So that for me is a sign that, the movement toward racial justice is building over time. I mean, it's not inevitably going to lead to equality or equity without hard work. But anyway, that's made me feel better in the last week.
I guess just a reminder of how many things are connected. And even if we're covering, global affairs and news and events in other countries, there's still relevance for what's happening in the U.S. domestically. And it cuts the other way as well. And, sometimes we, in our own editorial meetings too, we talk about how, and these instances of police brutality have been far too common over the last few years that, how do we square what's happening in the streets here in the U.S. with, what we're watching around the world and the editorial calendar and all the things we want to cover. And I think that some of that is obviously trying to sort of compartmentalize different subjects and issues. But I do think also, there are underlying connections, and that, what we define as politics or what we define as, just different issues that have different sort of sometimes silos or spheres are actually a lot more connected.
I think I'd just say, and it is a somewhat optimistic and hopeful final note, and I hope that events prove me right, because I was very concerned and worried 4 or 5 days ago, 3 days ago even, by the turn toward the military and the sense that the military leadership was playing along with Trump. And since then, it seems like that photo op that you mentioned, Freddy, had the opposite effect, both in terms of public opinion, but also within the institutions of the military, and I think in Washington as well. I think we've since seen a lot of backtracking about that, a lot of discomfort among the people who were at Trump's side during that photo op. I suspect they must have heard from up and down the chain of command, wherever they are in it, as well as from former colleagues and retired military leaders, that in perhaps the tumult and the excitement, they had actually lost touch with perspective on the role of the U.S. military in terms of domestic politics, which is neutrality and non-involvement. And so that to me is a hopeful sign, because it seems like Trump's corrosive effect has already been felt in the Justice Department and among congressional Republicans as well. So it's reassuring to see that that it hasn't necessarily corrupted the Defense Department, and it's scary to think that might be the last bastion. But it's reassuring to know that it's not actually, at this point, as we're recording, it seems like there might be more reticence and reluctance to be pulled in to Trump's agenda on this particular issue. All right, time for some WPR articles we want to flag for everyone. Freddy, which did you have in mind?
Our columnist Candace Rondo, who writes about the view of the protests in Washington, where she's based, and also reflecting on her career as a reporter and journalist, starting as a police reporter and then reporting on America's foreign wars, mainly in Afghanistan. As Candace writes, quote, "Like CNN's Omar Jimenez in Minneapolis this week, I've also been arrested for reporting while black. None of that, though, could have prepared me for the asphyxiating body blow of watching America's commander-in-chief threaten to turn the military on his own people, as if they were insurgents."
And Prachi?
I wanted to mention this week's feature by John Arne Flessner, which gives the background and context to what was a pretty shocking story that produced some good headlines about Lesotho last month. Prime Minister Tom Tabane, who may be facing murder and conspiracy charges in a case about the killing of his ex-wife in 2017, was finally forced to step down last month without any promise for immunity. John recalls the tumultuous history of Lesotho to explain why this shift is so significant, saying it could make for a new era in its politics. He writes, "The exit of Tabané and the arrival of Majoro opens a new window of opportunity for meaningful reform, if only the new generation of leaders has the vision and determination to take advantage of it by pivoting away from factional infighting to a system that prioritizes good governance and local control."
And I'll flag a briefing by Sarah Davies and Jackie True on the importance of gender inclusivity in pandemic response efforts. Sarah and Jackie explain that the absence of women in coronavirus task forces set up by governments worldwide reflects a similar lack of gender equality among political leadership, but also across societies more broadly. That's a problem not only because women leaders such as New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and German Chancellor Angela Merkel have been among the most effective at mobilizing their country's responses to the pandemic. The absence of women on coronavirus task forces also means that policymakers will likely fail to take into account the gender-specific impacts of both the pandemic and the responses they craft. Sarah and Jackie caution against the use of gender stereotypes to portray women leaders as inherently more caring and sensible than their male counterparts. But as they write, quote, "Increasing participation by women in high-level decision-making and fostering gender-inclusive responses to the pandemic are distinct agendas, but they are also complementary. Having more women in senior roles frequently leads to policies that are more sensitive to gender issues and inequalities," unquote. All right, two things I want to mention before we get to the Who Said That segment. First, if you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our free daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. And second, if you'd like to drop us a line with questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. All right, time for Who Said That? Freddy, why don't you kick things off?
Okay, here's the quote. "We all watch in horror and consternation what's going on in the United States. It is a time to pull people together, but it is a time to listen. It is a time to learn when injustices continue, despite progress over years and decades."
I know this one. Prachi?
Is this the EU's foreign policy?
No, it's you would have had to include a 21-second moment of silence before the start of the quote, I think, if it's Justin Trudeau.
That's true. A probably intentional, it seemed, sort of theatrical, long pause that Trudeau gave before he offered this answer to a question about what he thought of the protests and more importantly, Trump's role in them.
For once, something to actually compliment Justin Trudeau on. Prachi, what do you got for us?
Okay, you can name the place where this quote comes from. "Souls of martyrs shall forever linger despite the brutal massacre. Spark of democracy shall forever glow for the demise of evil."
Again, it's one that can apply pretty widely these days. I didn't see that one, so I don't have an idea. Freddy?
Yeah, I don't know either.
Okay, so this is something that students in Hong Kong wrote on a university campus bridge to commemorate the Tiananmen Square massacre. Hong Kong police banned a vigil that had been planned to commemorate the Tiananmen Square massacre on June 4th, which is the 31st anniversary of that event. And then a bunch of protesters turned out anyway, and there were gestures like this to show support and remembrance for that day.
All right, here's mine. You'll never get who actually said it, but if you can name who it was said to, that'll count as a correct answer. Here's the quote. "Can everyone get off the grass, please? Come on, I've just reseeded that." Freddie? I'm judging by Prachi's laugh that she doesn't know who it's about.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Freddie?
No, I wish it was, a much more gentle message to protesters in the United States somewhere, but I know that that's not the case.
It's not. I wish I could do the Australian accent, but it's a local resident at a new housing construction site in Gugong, Australia, where the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, had assembled the press to announce a $480 million stimulus package to help spur the construction sector's recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. Apparently, a bunch of the reporters were standing on this fellow's lawn, and in typical Aussie fashion, he very straightforwardly let them and the Prime Minister know that he wasn't amused. All right. Great stuff. Thanks, Freddie.
Thanks, Judah.
Thanks, Prachi.
Thanks, Judah.
If you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected WPR articles all week long, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. And if you'd like to send comments or questions, email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter, and you can find links to pieces covering the issues we talked about in the show notes on worldpoliticsreview.com. Have a great weekend, and see you next week for 2 new episodes of Trendlines.